good to be here this evening, and we're going to talk about washing the disciples' feet from John chapter 13, verses 1 through 17. It's not going to be a whole lot about foot washing, but about the lesson that Jesus was trying to teach his 12 apostles. Now, why did Jesus do this? Why did Jesus do something so menial, so low, we might say, as to wash the disciples' feet? Well, it was customary for someone who was giving a feast or planning a meal, as Jesus had. It was a Passover meal, but it was customary for the host to have a person there, a servant or a slave, if they owned a slave, who would actually wash the feet of the individual who came into the house or the room for the meal. But in this case, only Jesus and the 12 apostles are present. There are no servants, there are no slaves, and if this task was going to be done, somebody had to do it. Now the 12 apostles, remember, some of them had been arguing previous to this as to who would be the greatest in the kingdom. When Jesus started his kingdom, drove the Romans out and took the throne from the Herods, who was going to be greatest? Who was going to sit at his right hand? Who was going to sit at his left hand? So they've been fighting about these things. Luke chapter 22, verse 24 is one good reference for that. But none of the apostles were willing to lower themselves to perform such a service. So Jesus, just a few hours before his death, took this opportunity to impress upon the minds of the 12 how humility is shown by love in action. Not in words, but in deeds. Now we look at this whole passage, and we think about Jesus and what he's doing in washing the disciples' feet. We need to discover the motive of it, because every action has a motive. We might say that we did something without thinking about it, but really we know that we had thought about it. We just thought wrong, and we thought maybe we could get away with something, or we thought we deserved the right to do something or say something that just wasn't kosher, I guess we'd say. Just wasn't the right thing to do. But every action does have a motive behind it. And, the motive is something very important to look for. When policemen investigate crimes, and then prosecutors put criminals or put people on trial for the crimes, they're usually looking for the motive. Why did they do this? Was it just an accident? Was there an intention there? Well, Jesus had a great intention in washing the disciples' feet. Verses 1 through 3, John chapter 13. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it in the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from God and was going back to God. So in that text we find the motive. It was love for his own. And even though his hour, and that's how the phrase would be put out there, it was his hour, his last hour, so to speak, on earth. The next day, that night he was going to be betrayed. The next day he was going to be tried and crucified. His thoughts were on his disciples. His thoughts were about what could he do for them. What was the greatest thing that he could do for those 12 individuals to help them through this time? And it says he loved them to the end. So there you have the motive of it, but think also of the completeness of it. An idea only has value if it's acted upon. If there's, hey, it would be good if we would go and do this, so why don't you go and do it? Some people are idea people. Did you ever notice that? They got great ideas for somebody else to do something. But Jesus wasn't like that. He thought this is something that's needed, and he did it because he loved them, and he was going to do it. He was going to carry it out. So verses 4 and 5, he rose from supper, he laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. You think of it, Jesus could have hired a servant to come and do this. He could have hired somebody. He had sent 2 apostles ahead to prepare the room, get everything ready for this Passover feast. He could have even ordered one of them and said, hey, you're going to be the guy who washes everybody's feet. Now, you think about these guys who had been arguing about who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom, and then Jesus said, you're going to be the one to wash the feet. It doesn't look like I'm going to be on his right hand or on his left hand. I just don't think I'll even go to this feast. I'd be so unimportant. But so many things that he could have done, but he wouldn't do that because that was not his nature. He came to seek and to save. He came to serve the people that he dealt with, the people that he was leading. So without any assistance, he gave himself to the task. And here's a lot of the problem that existed. The apostles were full of pride. They'd argued about who was going to be greatest in the kingdom. Judas had already made up his mind. And that's what what John writes there. Jesus knew it. Judas had already made up his mind. He was going to betray Jesus for 40 pieces of silver to the high priest, turn him over to them. And listen, he may have thought, I've seen Jesus get out of a lot of troubles. I'll just do this, I'll get the money, and Jesus will walk away, just like he always does. Wasn't going to be that way this time. But Judas, was he going to wash their feet? Probably not. Peter, you think about Peter, and as we go down through this, think about what he does. Listen to the conversation here. At first, he doesn't want Jesus to wash his feet. Lord, you're going to wash my feet? But then later on, he said that would be beneath his dignity for sure, and he would think that would be beneath Jesus' dignity to do something like this. Look at verse 6. He came to Simon Peter and said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Verse 7, Jesus answered him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand. I say, I don't understand it now. I'll understand it later. Something's going to happen in the process, right? When this is done, when Jesus washes my feet, I'm going to understand something. Then Peter, he's going to dictate to Jesus dictate to whom and how Jesus would serve. Verse 8. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. If you don't allow me to do this, Peter, you may as well walk out the door right now. Because you have no part of me if you don't allow this. Think about that. Think about the times when Peter would argue with Jesus, and Jesus would say, get behind me, Satan. That's the type of person Peter was. But in this, let's say, I don't understand it now. If he doesn't, I'll understand it. No, don't wash my feet. Don't wash my feet. If you don't allow me to wash your feet, you got no part in me, no share with me in my ministry, in my kingdom, all of these things. So not understanding the meaning, well, what does he do? He does what he always does, right? Jumps to conclusions. Yeah, Peter got a lot of exercise, jumping to conclusions. And he's usually wrong when he does that. And he jumps to another one. Simon Peter said to him, this is in verse 9, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. My feet just aren't enough. Do all of me. Well, think about what he's saying here, and maybe what he thought in his mind that Jesus meant by, you don't understand it now, you'll understand it later, and if you don't let me do this, you won't have a share with me. He may have thought that this was somehow going to provide some spiritual cleansing. But he was wrong, wasn't he? There wasn't a spiritual cleansing here. Or, secondly, perhaps he thought that Jesus was going to anoint him as his successor. Remember, this was a group of unhappy people when they came together for Passover. They'd been arguing about who was going to be greatest in the kingdom. Jesus had told them he was going to die. Peter argued with him about it. No, I'm not going to let that happen. You can't stop it, Peter. What's going to happen? Who's going to take Jesus' place? And you remember from the Old Testament, they anointed priests and kings and prophets. Now here's Peter. Hey, get my hands, Jesus, while you're at it. Get my hand, and also my head. And the anointing of the head. You go back to the story or the account of the first high priest, Aaron, being anointed. The oil flowed down over his head and over his garments. There's a psalm that's written about this, talking about fellowship and such, and how sweet that would be, how wonderful that would be to be anointed. So he might have thought that here was Jesus. He'd washed the disciples' feet. Maybe he got the 11 already, but when he gets to the 12th one, Peter says, no, not me. And then through this, he begins to think, he washed their feet. How about my hands? How about my head? That'll show them who's important. That will show them who's going to be the next leader. Well, that gets us to the purpose of it, doesn't it then? The purpose of it, for some reason this act had to be done, and that's what purpose is about. You know, we might want to do something, or we might think, well, I ought to do this, you know, we got a motive and such, but what use is it? There's got to be, if there's no purpose in it, why do we do it? Now, I know sometimes we as human beings, and especially we as men, just do something without any purpose at all. We just do something sometimes just to do it, you know. The wife says, why are you doing that? Well, I just thought it needed to be done, you know. But Jesus had a purpose in this. Jesus said to him, the one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet. And we talked about this before, I think. Remember, when they walked the street, there weren't any sidewalks. They walked out in the streets, and that's where the horses and the donkeys and the cattle and all those things walk, and they don't care where they do their business. So when you walked out in those streets, even if you bathed and you just went next door to somebody's house, imagine what you would be tracking in on your feet. The rest of you's pretty clean. That's what Jesus is talking about here. You are clean, but not every one of you, for he knew who was to betray him. That was Judas, right? That was why he said, not all of you are clean. So to cleanse the body but of dirt, and especially the feet in this instance, was a matter of hospitality. Jesus desired to cleanse and refresh their bodies by the application of the water. Wash their feet, wipe them off. Now they ought to be comfortable here, and they know that they are welcome here. That's kind of what hospitality is, isn't it? Letting people know that they're welcome in that group or in your home or wherever it is. So this he did physically in this sense, and it was accomplished in the 12. But that was not his only purpose, right? That was not his only purpose, just to wash their feet. More importantly, he desired to cleanse their hearts of the sins of pride and selfish ambition and strife, because that's what they had been involved in now for however long. It may have been a couple months or 6 months, whatever. I'm more important than you are. I'm closer to Jesus than you are. James and John had their mother come to Jesus. Grant that one of my sons will sit on your right hand and the other on the left hand. They even got their moms involved, or at least these ones did. So how do you get rid of that pride, that selfish ambition and strife? Well, that can't be done by washing people's feet. That can only be done by washing a person's conscience. The conscience of the sins of pride and selfish ambition and strife. And the example that he gives does that. The example of washing their feet with water is an example that's supposed to lead to and get them to see true humility that's needed to be a leader in Christ's kingdom, in the church of Christ. This cleansing was eventually accomplished in the 11, right? But not in 12. It kind of worked for Peter and the rest of them, except for Judas. Didn't change Judas' mind about betraying Jesus. It didn't cleanse his conscience. It worked somewhat for the others, especially as they went through life. But for Judas, Jesus washed his feet, but his heart was just as filthy and corrupt as it had been growing that whole period of time when he's thinking about betraying Jesus. This is the great object lesson Jesus was trying to teach them and is trying to teach us. We can have our bodies clean, but if our hearts, our conscience is dirty, it's not going to do us any good. So, the example that Jesus gave, the example of it, and here's the important thing, the example of it has to be explained, right? John explains it. And I'm glad he does, because that helps us to get it. Verses 12 through 16. When he, that's Jesus, had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master." That this was to be an example to them, not an act of worship. Do we understand the difference? I hope that we do. I know that there are some out there in the religious world that don't, so they practice foot worshiping or foot washing as a matter of worship. But Jesus isn't saying, I want you to include this, just like you do the Lord's Supper. What he's saying, I want you to look at the example of what I've done and follow it. Well, what kind of an example? It was an example of love. 1 John chapter 3 verse 18, John, later on, near the end of that 40-year period as the New Testament's being completed, he says, little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. I wonder if he was remembering that night in John 13 when he wrote this many years later. That example of love was still there, wasn't it? Still there. And it's still there for us. What kind of an example was it? It was an example of humility. Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 through 28. But Jesus called them to him. Called who to him? Guess who? It's the disciples again, these 12, right? All right. He calls them to him and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. Man, didn't they get that lesson? Yeah. Don't we get that lesson? This is the key thing. We know that they didn't right then. Do we get it? See, we got to get it also. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's before John 13, if you put it in, all in chronological order. What were they missing? Why were they missing it? Well, they needed that example of humility also to be able to understand this. What kind of an example? Hey, this is an example of how we should even treat our enemies. Wow, I got to treat my enemies nice? Well, really, we shouldn't have any enemies, should we? Now, we understand there are going to be people who are our enemies because they make themselves our enemies, but we shouldn't go around and say, hey, that person's my enemy. I'm against them. Because that isn't the way that Christ was. That wasn't how Jesus practiced life. Romans chapter 12, verse 20 and 21, Paul speaking says, to the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And this heaping burning coals on his head, you can imagine it's like, man, there's my enemy, and I'm going to do him good, so he'll just burn with rage. No, they had a custom back in those days that if you offended your neighbor in some way, and your neighbor that does good or whatever, but anyway, you get to be sorrowful for what you've done, they would take a clay pot, a little clay pot, and they put hot ashes in it, and they put it on their head, and they go and they knock on the door, and they'd actually, they wouldn't be smiling, they'd have that frown, and they would look like, I am so sorry. This is how sorry I am that I sinned against you, that I offended you, or I did this, or whatever. And the person who had been offended would look at it and say, I forgive you. That's what that heaping, burning coals on somebody's head means. That they would be sorrowful for what they've done, and that they would repent. Not that there'd be some kind of a vengeance there for the individual. And that's better than vengeance, isn't it? When somebody repents, when somebody changes, that is so wonderful. That's better than all the vengeance in the world that we could ever imagine. 12 apostles began this evening unhappy with their lot in life. Can you imagine that? Walking with Jesus for 3.5 years and get to this point in time and they're unhappy, they're griping, they're complaining, kind of like the Israelites as we talked about them a little bit this morning. And why are they unhappy? Well, they're confused about the future. Jesus said, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to die. I'm going to leave you behind. For a little while you're going to see me, then you won't see me, but then you'll see me again. They just didn't understand it all. Why did he have to die? Who was going to take care of them? If he's going to be the king, what did that mean to their movement? They were a pitiful crew. But when Jesus left them this example, he also left them a blessing if they would follow his example. Look at verse 17. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. So this whole passage becomes a visual parable for the apostles, an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It's all right to humble yourself, to do some of the menial things that nobody would want to do, because that's what it takes for us to get to heaven. That's the example that he set. John 13:35. Say just a little while later. By this will all people know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. Yeah. They began that evening very unhappy with their lot in life, and it didn't get really much better for them until the resurrection of Jesus, right? I'll tell you a story. There are a lot of people that I know, probably a lot of people that you know in the church, who are unhappy with their lot in life. Because even though they're members of the church, and even though they call Jesus Lord, they haven't found the meaning of true happiness yet, which is serving one another out of love. Humbly serving one another out of love. Hey, that's the lesson for tonight. You want to be happy? Be a servant. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. If you have a need, let your request be made known. Stand and sing the invitation song.